As I said before, Moses' life, there's a lot written about it, and it's a little bit overwhelming, honestly, to consider what to share. And we know a little bit later that Moses really owned his nothingness in that he says, "Who am I?" A very far cry from the person that we saw in Egypt, but there was still aspects that Moses needed to learn. As we, see in this passage, he was overly focused on self and in many ways was resistant to the call of God and his commission and what he wanted him to do, even though the Lord was gracious to him and said that I will be with thee. And he gave him that promise. Moses asked what his name was if people were to ask him when he went back to Egypt. And the Lord said, I am that I am. There was a reference to the eternal one, the self-existent one, the one who always was and is and will be. We know that was the same name that he referred himself to. I believe it was in John chapter 8 as well. We know that the Lord showed or worked through him signs as affirmation that he would be with him. But I think that really these were meant to strengthen Moses in the weakness that he felt. But Moses still continued to hold back. He claimed that he couldn't speak well. And in effect, he basically said, send anybody else but me. 5 times, I believe it was, he raised objections to the Lord, presuming that the Lord would forbear with him. And it unfortunately ends in the Lord's anger being kindled against Moses because Moses just continued to resist and resist. This is a problem that I've had in my own life where sometimes I sense the Lord wanting me to do something, and it's very easy to be stubborn or to resist and bring self into focus where it ought not to be. And Moses had a lot to learn, as I have a lot to learn in this regard. Even though the Lord was tremendously long suffering towards him and showed forbearance towards him when these multiple times where Moses gave excuse after excuse. Now, the one who had been learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds in those first 40 years. This was a very different person, but I think in part he tended perhaps towards self-pity over everything that happened. And one thing I think is good to point out is that the Lord's purposes will not be frustrated despite our disobedience. But we know it came at a cost because the Lord did basically say that Aaron would come and be his mouthpiece. Aaron was instrumental with the golden calf and initiating what happened there. And so there was a price to pay when it was not really the Lord's original desire that it be with respect to Aaron. Another thing I found instructive with respect to Moses' life is at the end of chapter 4, something that needed to be dealt with respect to his own family. And we know there in chapter 4, verse 24, the Lord met him by the way and sought to kill him because he had not yet circumcised his son. And his wife was extremely angry and called him a bloody husband. I think about that with respect to the commission he was given, that there was something that needed to be dealt with his own family before he could be fully used of the Lord. Those of us on the call who are fathers, we understand in part that there are things we know need to be dealt with at times within our own family. And we need to be obedient to what the Lord's asking us to do in that regard. With respect to my own father, sometimes when there were things not right within the family household, he perhaps didn't feel free to share or speak if he knew there was trouble. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there were lessons Moses needed to learn in that wilderness path with respect to raising children, either for good or for bad. We should strive to find a helpmeet. The next period of his life really are the last 40 years where he really learns that God is everything, that he is nothing. And perhaps this is what most of his life is written about. I can't but scratch the surface of just a few things during this period of his life. I thought I would mention a few things in passing. Hebrews 11, it makes clear the faith that Moses exhibited when he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood around the doorposts. As instructed, he exhibited that faith and was commended for it. Exodus chapter 14, start verse 13. Before I read that, I'll just say this is really as they stood at the shores of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians were coming, and the Red Sea was in front of them, and the people were getting upset, and they thought that the path seemed hopeless. But he says there in verse 13, "Fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians you've seen today, you shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." And it's nice to see at the outset here of these 40 years in the wilderness that Moses says clearly and emphatically it would be the Lord who would fight for them. And they just needed to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. We have seen a turning of the corner in Moses' life. There wasn't reliance on self. There wasn't the self-pity or the reluctance we saw before, but what we see here is him encouraging the Israelites to stand still to see what God would do and to see the salvation that he wrought that day. And so I just thought I had mentioned that. In chapter 15, he was the one that led in song with the Israelites and said there in verse 1, "I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea." And so he shares in the triumph with God's people. And I'm sure it was a tremendous encouragement to Moses as he saw what God did and all that he had promised that he would do. The Lord had made it clear that Pharaoh wouldn't let them go immediately, that he would resist, harden his heart, and that there would be signs performed. Moses saw all that happen, and I'm sure it strengthened him and strengthened his faith in God. I want to just briefly mention Exodus chapter 18 as well with respect to the striking of the rock. We can only make a few passing remarks on these things here this afternoon. But if there's one thing that Moses seemed to experience often, it was the fact that the people often complained under his leadership. They murmured and tended to find fault. And here in chapter 17, we know that this is a wonderful type of the death of Christ and how he was smitten there as an example, or the rock being the type of Christ there, the one who was smitten for us. I think of Moses when the people began to murmur and complain, and he brings it to the Lord in prayer. This is chapter 17, verse 4. He said, "They'd be almost ready to stone me." He went to the right place. He brought it to the Lord. Um, the people had no right to feel the way they did. They had just seen the manna given in the previous chapter. They had learned that the Lord was the one who would provide for their temporal needs, whether it be food or drink. In this chapter, we know that they're thirsty and desperate, and they were almost at the point of wanting to kill or stone Moses. And so he brings it to the Lord. Find in Moses' life an example of humility and meekness in difficult circumstances. We know he was called the meekest man in all the earth. We know he was not perfect, and later we'll touch on it. He failed. The Lord told him to go before the people and to take his rod that he had smote the river with. And the Lord affirmed that he would stand before him there on the rock in Horeb, and he was instructed to smite the rock. And it says, "There shall come water out of it, that the people may drink." And it says Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. It's just a wonderful type of Christ, the one who was that rock who was smitten. And 1 Corinthians 10 makes it clear that he is that rock. I appreciated some thoughts that Don Rule shared. What's brought out here wonderfully the blessing that came and was poured out as a result of the death of Christ. It was like those waters gushed out. It uses that terminology in Psalm 105, that it gushed out and it filled the dry places. And Don had mentioned, I thought it was beautiful, it was like the heart of God that had been contained for so long, this heart of blessing for his people. The offer of salvation was all predicated on the basis of the death of Christ, and now it could go forth unhindered to the whole world. We see that in type, these waters pouring forth out of this rock here as Moses strikes it, and the people drank in abundance from it. Moses had the privilege of being that instrument God used to bring waters of refreshment to the people of God. Exodus 33. And in the previous chapter, we know that this was the story where the golden calf was constructed and the people went a whoring after it. And it was a tremendous sin and grieved God's heart, and it grieved Moses' heart. We see Moses there as intercessor, really for the people of Israel, and being willing to put himself in the breach and basically saying he was willing to die alongside God's people, but he pleaded on their behalf that they be spared. On this next chapter, which is precious to my heart, Moses recognized the seriousness of the sin of the people. Chapter 33, verse 7, it says, Moses took the tabernacle and pitched it without the camp, afar off from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of the congregation. And it came to pass that every one which sought the Lord went out unto the tabernacle of the congregation, which was without the camp. I think that this showed spiritual discernment on Moses' part. It was not something the Lord had commanded him to do, but he recognized that because of the seriousness of the sin, there needed to be a separation from that camp. So he erects this tent outside the camp and called it the tabernacle of the congregation. I think it's precious to note that it says that everyone which sought the Lord went out unto the tabernacle of the congregation, which was without the camp. For those of us on the call who are gathered to the Lord's name, this holds a preciousness to our own hearts as it gives a glimpse of the principle that there needed to be separation from the evil going on in that camp at that time. 2 Timothy bears the principle of what I'm trying to say pretty clearly as to the importance of separation. Moses acted on that principle, going out to that place outside the camp, and not just him, all those who sought the Lord. It says in verse 9, it came to pass as Moses entered into the tabernacle, the cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. The presence of the Lord descended upon that little place separate outside the camp. And so separation is important in our day too. We know that we live in a time where there's much confusion and sin, even within the great house that professes to call itself Christianity. The principle does remain about the fact that there does need to be separation from all that is wrong in God's sight. Moses exemplified spiritual discernment and entering into both the character of God and understanding his holiness that required it to be in the state of the people in terms of what it was. And Moses, unlike anybody else in Scripture, had the privilege of entering into a relationship with God that he stands alone in many respects. And so it says in verse 11 that the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face as a man speaks unto his friend. I think that highlights the closeness that Moses had with God himself. It goes back to the burning bush, where God made it clear as to his holiness and that Moses couldn't stand in his presence with his shoes on. He understood the holiness of God and what that meant and what the implications of that were. There's another thing I think is really neat in this chapter. That Moses expresses some desires of the Lord. Found in verse 13, he said, I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, that I might find grace in thy sight. And consider that this nation is thy people. He wanted to know God. The Lord's response to Moses was so gracious. He says, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. Moses is learning step by step that God is the sole source of all that he needed, and really the one that he could depend on, and the one that really was everything to him. Paul could express later that I might know him. And that should be the desire of each of our hearts, that we would know him and to know his ways. And knowing his ways sometimes requires in life that we go through suffering and difficult times and understanding the heart of God. And Moses was learning that through the schoolhouse of God. And he wasn't content to leave it there. He asks later in verse 18, he said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And the Lord shows his glory, although he was hid in the cleft of the rock. And he was covered there by God's hand as he passed by. And as we enjoy the Lord, it should have that effect in our life that it will produce even more desire to know him in a deeper way. And I think that is what we see in part here. Moses expresses that desire to know him and his ways, God's glory. Another thing I want to mention with respect to Moses is in Numbers chapter 12, in reference to him being called the meekest man. This is when Aaron and Miriam spoke against Moses. They had accused him or spoke badly about how he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they said in verse 2, hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it. And we know that Miriam in particular has exacted a heavy price to pay because of this rebellion and leprosy. She became leprous, it says, white as snow in verse 10. Moses, despite being accused, even by his own family, goes on to intercede on their behalf. Immediately after this, Aaron pleaded with Moses after this happened. He said, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us wherein we have done foolishly, wherein we have sinned. Moses later cried unto the Lord for her and said, heal her now, O God, I beseech thee. Moses was criticized time and time again by the people, and here by his own family, Aaron and Miriam. And our natural inclination when being criticized is often, I think, to get defensive or to act in the flesh. And you don't see that with Moses here at all. He intercedes for Miriam immediately. He doesn't seem to hold it against her at all. He pleads to the Lord for her. And I think that is just one example of many that you could point to really in his own life. Under the face of criticism, Moses demonstrated that meekness for which he was so well known. Next thing I want to point out is his failure. Found in Numbers chapter 20. Moses was not a perfect man. There was much in his life that was failure. But this well-known passage here in Numbers chapter 20, we know that he was instructed to speak to the rock and not strike it. The people here were upset, just like they were many years before. in that they were thirsty. This was, we believe, towards the end of the wilderness journey, very close to the end of the 40 years. This was probably largely the next generation. And the same failure that we see in their fathers, we see in the children here. They basically cry out for something to drink. It says in verse 10 that Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. I'm sure that most everyone on the call knows that in type here, the rock being Christ was something that was only done once and was not to be repeated. And this is why he was asked to speak to the rock and not smite it. There are really two things here in particular that were serious to be pointed out. One of them was quite simply that Moses acted in the flesh. In verse 10, when he called them rebels, which was factually true, he said, must we fetch you water out of this rock? He didn't give credit to the Lord for the miracle that was to God. He inserted himself in that. It was a very serious matter, really, that this was not due to any power on Moses' part. This was all power on God's part, but yet he took the credit for it or inserted him into a place that he ought not to have belonged. And further than that, he took up the rod and he smote that rock twice in anger. The heart of God had not changed in that the water still poured forth. His heart was not restrained or prevented the blessing that would pour out to those Israelite people despite their failure and Moses' failure here. But the Lord still loved his people. He cared for their physical or temporal needs. And so the water came out despite the failure in this story. And we know, unfortunately, it came with serious consequences for Moses, and that he was not allowed to enter the land as a result of his disobedience. I think we all can relate to the failure of Moses here. I'm not trying to justify what he did at all. It was direct disobedience to what the Lord had asked him to do. As someone myself who tends to be impatient, at times it's very easy to see that we are all prone to the same failure that Moses showed here that day. He had, for lack of better words, reached his breaking point with the people in that when they cried out against him and they said, why have you made us to come up out of Egypt to bring us unto this evil place? And they said, this is no place of figs or vines or pomegranates, and there's no water. And they were just acting in a terrible manner, and they just pointed it all in Moses' head. And Moses acted in a moment of frustration in a way that he shouldn't have, and it wasn't right. And you might think, wasn't the Lord being overly harsh with Moses? And the answer is no. He is holy, he is just, he's always going to do what is right. And Moses had to pay, you might say, a heavy price in that he couldn't enter the land because of this. But yet, I think it's nice to see that the heart of God was still the same in blessing towards his people. And just some final remarks. And at the end of Deuteronomy, at the end of his life, we know with Moses at the end of his life, was not able to enter the land. And I do want to comment on that. But before I do, I think about the Moses here at the very end of his life and reflecting all of God's ways and all that he had learned. And I know a verse that comes to mind that my dad often used to read with respect to Moses in Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3, and I'll just read it. says, "Thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee, to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or no. And he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live." Moses was saying this to Israel, but I'm sure as he spoke those words, he reflected as to what it meant to his own life. And I think it's good for all of us to reflect God's ways in our own life, all the way that he has led through the wilderness journey, to humble us, to prove us, to know what was in our own hearts. Because despite the hills and the valleys in Moses' life, I'm sure that Moses could echo the words of those of what I just read fully and in a deeper way, you might say, of knowing how God dealt with him in grace and in love over many years, over those 120 years of his life. And it really wasn't until that final chapter in his life, the final 40 years, where he realized that God was the one he should live for and serve, and the one who could fulfill the longings and the desires of his heart. As I said at the beginning of the call, I don't think anyone here will live to 120, but if we were just to break this into 25-year segments, I know in my own life, I relate so much to the life of Moses because we're so slow to learn God's ways and to recognize that he alone is the one who can bring the full satisfaction of our hearts, the one who really deserves first place in our life. So often we give him the leftovers. We don't give him the first place. And yet that is what. So at the twilight of his life here, even though he was not able to enter the land, we see him going up to the top of Mount Pisgah with the Lord. And it says, the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, and the south and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zoar. And the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, and to Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. He had the immense privilege of being in direct company with the Lord himself, to look out over from that mountaintop to see what God had promised to Abraham so many years before, was perhaps even a higher experience than had he walked with the Israelites down across the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, because he got to see it from God's perspective and God's view. And I think it shows God's grace really to Moses. And as a type, Moses, it was fitting in that he could not enter the land, not only because of his sin, but we know that the ministry of Moses was that of law, God's authority. And really, the law could not bring us into that place of blessing. It could not bring us into what Canaan represents. And in that respect, it was really fitting that Moses did not cross and go into that land. But God also showed him, despite his government that he showed to Moses for his failure, he showed him grace, because he stood there and looked out over that land with Moses and had a bird's eye view over all that God had promised those 400 years before earlier. Moses, I don't know what went through his mind at that time. I think it's interesting that it points out that his eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated at this point in his life. He didn't need cataract surgery. He got to see in full view and all the splendor of it, of all that God promised, with no dimness to it. And I think it was the Lord's goodness to Moses that he allowed him to see it, what was promised and what would be given. And many, many years later, we see Moses there in the land with Elias on the Mount of Transfiguration with the Lord himself. And so in a certain sense, you could point forward to those many years later where he did set foot in that land and shared it in company with the Lord himself there. But here at the twilight of his life, before he died, he got to share in that experience with the Lord himself. And so that's just some overview or thoughts I had of Moses' life. There's a verse that comes to mind when I think about his life as a whole, and it's found in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 14 and 15. It says, "For the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. And he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again." And what I would say to each and every one in this call and those who will listen afterwards, it is only the love of Christ and an enjoyment of that love that will keep any one of us walking in the path of faith. And to the extent that we enjoy that love in the measure of our own souls, may it cause us really to not live for ourselves, but to live unto him, or to the one who died for us, as it says there in that verse. It's so easy to live through life selfishly. Moses could have remained in Pharaoh's house and enjoyed all that the world had to offer. But I think what in Moses' life is him overcoming this present world. He overcame the seductions that came with all that Pharaoh's house had to offer. And he got to enjoy the Lord's company and closeness and got to see that land that God had promised. Which was better, to remain in Pharaoh's house and to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, or to turn his back on it and choose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God and to walk hand in hand with the one who he had his eye on, the King of Glory. I just share those few thoughts with respect to Moses' life. It's a life that I've reflected on my own part, is that tendency to be easily seduced by the world and what it has to offer. And yet Moses stands as a great example, really, of one who was an overcomer and walked the path of faith, humbleness before his God. Really is a great example for each one of us that we might follow in his steps. I know he is not a perfect example. He's a representation of the law. There was failure in his life, but there is much there to be gleaned from it. May the Lord make this an encouragement to all of us as we consider his life and his path and his faith.